Welcome to our study of cutting through spiritual materialism. I'm very pleased that we're doing this. I'm slightly awed, intending to do my best with this very important text. This is, and I know I'm always coming with quite a few superlatives with these texts that we study, and they are all really extraordinary, which is obviously why we study them. But I think in terms of the modern Buddhist students coming to the project of enlightenment, it's almost impossible without reading this book, because it presents some insights that are, of course, implicit in Buddhism, but formulates and identifies some problems that we inevitably have on the path very clearly in modern language. And so I think that this is a very, very helpful book. In my own journey, this was really an important book in terms of basically generating faith in the Buddhist teaching and also becoming aware of the pitfalls of the path and giving an idea of what the path is about. So it's a book that's been with me for many years, but that doesn't mean that I feel, you could say, confident that I can do proper service to this work. But at the same time, I'm happy to do this within a Sangha context, really just sharing this valuable text, and I shall do so to the best of my ability. So the format, let's just see here. Let me just check. I'm just take a sound check. Can you hear me? Somebody's saying they can't hear. Sometimes this happens across. You can hear? Okay, that's good. Yeah. Sometimes there are problems with the individual receivers. Okay, good. All right. So I've put this verse in from the Sadhana Mahamudra, which is an impressive liturgy that Chögyam Trungpa wrote after he had been in the West some years and then went back to Bhutan, where he did a retreat in Tiger's Nest, Taksang, in the Paro Valley. And at that time, he had a vision that unified the practice lineages of the Kaji and the Nyingma, and he wrote a very beautiful liturgy, and this is then taken from there. The joy of spontaneous awareness, which is with me all the time. Is not this your smiling face, O Kama Padmakara? Although I live in the slime and muck of the dark age, I still aspire to see it. Although I stumble in the thick black fog of materialism, I still aspire to see it. Trungpa Rinpoche was born in 1938, passed away in 1987, and he was recognized as the Tuku of the 10th Trungpa, who was very close with the first Jamgun Kongtrul, Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, the Khyentse Rinpoche. Dilgu Khyentse Rinpoche met the 10th Trungpa, and hence also throughout his life, he was very devoted to Chögyam Trungpa, and right from his early ages, from the early age of Trungpa Rinpoche, he came and visited him when he was the young abbot of Surmang Monastery, which is in eastern Tibet. So Trungpa Rinpoche trained under Shichin Kongtrul, a very great and accomplished master, and similarly also a great Khenpo, Khenpo Gangsha Wangpo. These are the Trungpa Rinpoche's two main teachers. He was by incarnation, but also as a result of his capacity, natural disposition, and so on, he was from a very early age regarded as a lineage holder, and right from the age of 4, he was having revelations which we qualify as or refer to as treasure revelations. Already in his in his early years, like 8 or 9, he was having great treasured teachings that he was putting down into writing. And by the time he was 12 and 13, he already was conducting great teaching sessions to thousands of people. He was a great poet. We have poetry that he composed in Tibet. He was a great artist. Also, his line drawings from his travels in Tibet are extraordinary. You can find them in Born in Tibet. He came to India then in 1959. He was appointed the director of what was called Young Lama's Home, which was a place where young, important Tibetan teachers, they were taught English and learned about the modern world. He received a fellowship, a grant to study at Oxford. So he went to England in 1963, I think. And there he undertook studies of comparative religion, psychology, and so forth. He began teaching, having students, and he also married there. Then in, I think, 1970 or 71, he traveled to America at the invitation of some of his American students. And there he founded a Buddhist organization which was known as the Vajradhatu. This has in later years then become what, until recently at least, was known as Shambhala. Anyway, under the umbrella of the Vajradhatu, Trungpa Rinpoche taught a lot, and over the next 10, 15 years, taught all over, directing teaching and practice programs. He initiated what is known as dhatuns, which are month-long sitting practices, retreats practically. He taught seminars, which were 3 months every year. For a number of years, he would teach for 3 months for those interested in beginning the tantric path, teaching the foundations, the theoretical and practical foundations of the Vajrayana. He undertook translations, founded the Nalanda Translation Committee. To those students that completed the preliminary Vajrayana preliminaries, he empowered and trained them. He eventually founded Shambhala Training, which he referred to as a secular training program. And during his time in the States, he was someone who produced beautiful calligraphy, paintings, taught Ikebana, founded a theater group, wrote prodigiously poetry and also other writings. And as an author, we have from him 8 big volumes, 8 big tomes, which are his collected works, but we also have innumerable other works as well that are continually being added. He was a treasure teacher, so we have, and these are now being translated, then the Terma teachings that he established when he was in Tibet, and we still have recordings from his teachings. Possibly most famous among all his writings then is the book that we're presently studying, Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. In the foreword, then, we have in the present edition foreword by Sakyong Mipam, his eldest son, and he writes, "In order to understand a spiritual path, we must acknowledge and understand our own mind, now, as it pertains to the journey. What misunderstandings and concepts we may have about a spiritual practice, we must overcome, so that we are not merely practicing according to our own conceptualized idea." This is a very important point, and Trungpa Rinpoche then further elaborates here, and this is then the actual introduction of Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. He says, there are numerous sidetracks which lead to a distorted, ego-centered version of spirituality. We can deceive ourselves into thinking we are developing spiritually, when instead we are strengthening our egocentricity through spiritual techniques. This fundamental distortion may be referred to as spiritual materialism. So Cutting Through is some talks that were given in 1970 to 71, and they were then a response to the needs of the very sincere students of VCTI, is the Vijayadhara Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, which is very often a way that this sort of is the acronym that people often use for him. In those years, of course, this is a universal phenomenon, but this was intended to address the confusion, misunderstandings, and expectations that Rinpoche perceived and could see. So basically, this is about spirituality and the dangers of spirituality, how the delusion of ego can be sustained through. And then Trungpa Rinpoche speaks about 3 lords of materialism and how the pattern of ego is sustained through these 3 lords and how this pattern is remedied through the path of meditation. I want to make a point about this book, and I don't have it in the presentation here, but that really is that the question and answers are very valuable. He had some very intelligent students, so I warmly recommend reading the question and answers in the book. Trungpa Rinpoche's wife, Diana Mukpo, she writes, Rinpoche was definitely not one of those teachers who asked for obedience and wanted their students not to think for themselves. He thrived. He lived on the intelligence of his students. That is how he built his entire teaching situation. So this is also where we find then the language and the imagery and so on in the teachings of Trungpa Rinpoche don't come across as an Asian teacher who is proceeding cautiously within modernity. We read Trungpa Rinpoche completely as an insider of modernity. There's no sense of any foreignness. In this book, then, Trungpa Rinpoche first outlines the sidetracks, which is spiritual materialism, and he uses that then to discuss the genuine path of spiritual awakening. So, while we shouldn't enter this path naively, there is a very real and a very valid journey that has to be then undertaken. So, as I was just saying, despite the contemporary flavor, this is classical Buddhism. Trungpa Rinpoche masters the modern language, but what we have here is quintessential classical Buddhism as you find it reflected in all the various sutras and shastras. The subject matter of this book, spiritual materialism and Buddhist practice in general, is not in contradiction to theistic paths. The Buddhist view is that our awakened condition is innate, yet temporarily veiled by confusion, where the theistic paths sometimes begin with the glory of God and so on. But on the path to enlightenment, then, we understand that enlightenment is unveiling what was always there. Ego, and what we are addressing here, is the painful state of non-recognition. And we think this condition of non-recognition, ego, is who we are. So when I'm presenting this webinar, I have these PowerPoint points that I'm presenting that you see, and also I have some commentary, and I have some notes that go with this that I'm using when I'm presenting it. Sometimes I'll depart from my notes, obviously, but the format that I generally prefer, and which I try to sort of stick to, which is essentially intended to provide some quality of what I'm sitting here saying, is really that I read the bullets and then I come with the commentary afterwards. Anyway, very often what happens is that in presenting the bullets and I put a little bit of commentary on it, then I very often cover what I actually have in my notes. Anyway, just an important point. And that is that the objective of the Buddhist path is unveiling something that is basic to us. This awakened state of mind that is the objective of Buddhism. It's something that is innately who we are. So enlightenment is not constructed or something that we acquire. If it were, and Trungpa just goes to some length to make this point, he says it could come undone or be lost again. Rather, this nature is the very ground of reality, who we are. And yet, because of confusion, the ground is not seen, not recognized. The path the Buddha taught is intended to unveil what is there through burning up confusion by means of the path. So this is the objective of all the various Buddhisms we find in all the various traditions everywhere. What veils the original ground is this confused, rigid, delusional condition that we then call ego. It's not that ego is somebody or something that's bad and must be punished. The thing is, it's a delusion. And it really just occurs when the ground is not properly known. But once we are identifying with this condition, it serves really, and we become like a paranoid master, where we actually continually try to sustain ourselves. What we have is the a situation a bit like the sun, which is there despite it might being obscured by the clouds. And we, with enlightenment, we see clearly the sun. But the practice of the path and meditation and so on is that we need to clear away these clouds so that we can perceive the clouds. Trungpa Rinpoche says the absence of ignorance, of being crowded in, of paranoia. When we remove that, it opens up a tremendous view of life. One discovers a different way of being. So it's important that we understand what it is that we are dealing with. And this ego is implicitly described continually throughout this discussion we have in this book. It's very important that we understand what it is that we're dealing with. What is the object of purification? Trungpa Rinpoche says, we are conscious. Like he says, you're reading this or you're hearing this. But the process of consciousness is momentary, transitory. There's nothing solid about it. And yet, in our confusion, we take this consciousness to be solid and continuous. And we proceed to take this confused projection to be who we are, to think this is me. And that's the ego. The fact that consciousness isn't solid and it isn't continuous becomes a threat to our existence. And hence we are ending up struggling against reality. This paranoid and insecure project permeates every moment of our existence. But it's also naturally failing, and that's why we naturally suffer as a consequence. One good thing about this pain is then that it prompts our search for insight. So the mere fact that we are suffering, it indicates a basically healthy condition or disposition that is not well with the present state of affairs. Ego's strategies are described in terms of the three lords of materialism. Lord of form, our pursuit of physical safety and gratification. Lord of speech, our use of concepts to justify our rigidity. Lord of mind, the pursuit of spiritual and psychological ways of sustaining our sense of self. Ultimately, they are a hoax that we perpetuate, but it is a hoax that we need to free ourselves of. Trungpa Rinpoche says, three lords seduce us by creating a fundamental myth that we are solid beings. But ultimately, the myth is false, a huge hoax, a gigantic fraud, and it is the root of our suffering. And he also says, we cannot in any way free ourselves from the domination of the three lords unless we too cut through, layer by layer, the elaborate defenses of these lords. So since our ego doesn't exist, there's a place then where the ego is continually feeling threatened. So we engage in various ways of shielding ourselves from the truth. And this style of neurotic attitude is then described in terms of these three lords of materialism. So in there, Trungpa Rinpoche describes the lord of form as our pursuit of physical safety and gratification, as in our preoccupation that seeks to control the circumstances around us, avoid irritations. And he mentions a number of gadgets and devices and strategies that we have in the modern world. Of course, since that time, which is almost 50 years ago, we have a great deal more of that. Lord of speech is our concepts that we justify and sanctify our existence with. We have ideologies, we have leanings, opinions, attitudes, and so on. We belong to groups, beliefs, we have religions, we have political alliances or groups and so on that we identify with, and this solidifies our world. That's on the level of what we call the Lord of speech, using concepts to sanctify our existence. And then there's the Lord of Mind. And that's more subtle yet. That's the pursuit of spiritual and psychological ways of sustaining our sense of self. We don't actually engage in these paths as such, because very often these spiritual paths are conceived by persons that had gotten over the confusion of ego. But what happens is that we then mimic these practices as something that's external. We engage in a path and then we think of me in the path and we kind of externalize it. So the real path is, of course, that which is not about an external gimmick, but is that which is what we basically are. But as long as we treat the spiritual path as something external, we're just perpetuating then this sense of solidity. And that's very often the motivation. That is why we engage in it, because we think this is going to secure us. That is spiritual materialism. So, in order to free ourselves, the Buddha taught meditation. Of course, when we say meditation, we speak about meditation as an integration of insight. But we can say the heart then of this path is meditation. Trungpa Rinpoche says then, referring to the Buddha, that he began to realize that there was a sane, awake quality within him, which manifested itself only in the absence of struggle. And he says also that is the teaching, referring to meditation, that is the teaching of letting the mind be in a very open way, of feeling the flow of energy without trying to subdue it and without letting it get out of control, of going with the energy pattern of the mind. This is meditation practice. So the Buddha taught meditation to free us from the myth around the ego that we create in our insecurity. So with the practice of meditation, we discover gaps in the defenses of ego. We discover gaps in these narratives of solidity, and this enables us to let go of our struggle for solidity. So meditation is neither going into trance, nor is it mental gymnastics. It's letting be, going with what is, knowing our mind for what it is, not directing it according to the agenda then of our insecure ego. So letting be is very subtle, and it's not something we can learn from books or from YouTube and just from information, from data. It is something that's passed on in a living tradition, a living culture. And that's what we have until the present day, then, lineage masters that uphold the Buddha's inspiration. But in presenting the subtlety of this, Trungpa Rinpoche refers to a famous story about his student Shona, who was a sitar player who was learning meditation. And he was taught to balance this tight and looseness of mind, just as one would when tuning a sitar. So in here we actually have some very helpful instruction in meditation. We recognize that the three lords use thoughts as their first line of defense. Second and third lines of defense are then the emotions and our concepts. And we apply meditation to discover the futility of this struggle, this defense that the three lords put up. Trungpa Rinpoche says, in true meditation, there is no ambition to stir up thoughts, nor is there an ambition to suppress them. They are just allowed to occur spontaneously and become an expression of basic sanity. They become the expression of the precision and the clarity of the awakened state of mind. So, with regards to the thoughts, then the first line of defense, meditation is then our way of seeing through the control that the thoughts normally impose on us. It actually gives our mind an opportunity to rest from these struggles. It's not about reassuring us. It's not doing this on the conditions or the premises of our insecure egos, but is rather discovering that our defenses, the defenses of these three lords, is unnecessary. We make friends with the energy and power of our mind. So if we see through the game of thoughts when we're practicing meditation, not being affected by the thoughts, then the next strategy of the Lord is of these lords is emotions. This is then where you would say the ego miffed at losing its ground, where we maybe feel groundless. Then we need to have something to hold on to. Then we have the emotions, and they hold us a bit more deeply, almost at a physical level. Again, in meditation we see them, but we do not allow them to engage or control us. So there's no suppressing the emotions, but there's also not being controlled or submissive to them. If we see through thoughts and emotions, the two first lines of defenses, then there's the even more subtle line of defense, which is our concepts, our beliefs in what we then think of as truths, these objective labelings that serve to provide us with a solid sense of what is. This is just how it is. We think like that. It's not questionable. And these rigid labelings we then dismantle in meditation as well. In the practice of meditation, we also let go of them. We see the lack of reality of these concepts. I'd like to say this is also where the study of Buddhism is very important, because some of these assumptions we have about reality are very deeply anchored, and we actually need to do studies like the middle way teachings, the Madhyamika teachings, to see through these assumptions about reality. Some people might think Madhyamika is about refuting Indian schools of thoughts, but that's not at all the case. The Indian schools of thoughts, or basically any school of dogma or assumption, is what we refute with Madhyamika. It doesn't have to be Indian. So really, with the study of Madhyamika, it is dismantling our assumptions about our subjective experience and also objective experience. So this is not just to be, you could say, cool or deconstructionist, but it's just seeing through the assumptions and the hoax that these lords of these three lords of materialism they operate with. Finally, in this chapter, then Trungpa ends by saying, by the examination of his own thoughts, emotions, concepts, and the other activities of mind, the Buddha discovered that there is no need to struggle to prove our existence, that we need not be subject to the rule of the three laws of materialism. There is no need to struggle to be free. The absence of struggle is in itself freedom. This egoless state is the attainment of Buddhahood. The process of transforming the material of mind from expressions of ego's ambition into expressions of basic sanity and enlightenment through the practice of meditation, this might be said to be the true spiritual path. By the way, as you can see up here, then next to the chapter heading above, I also put in some page numbers. This is from what I think is the most common edition, the 2002 Shambhala edition of Cutting Through. So you have the page numbers up there. This, of course, doesn't apply if you're reading a Kindle edition, but anyway, thought it might be helpful. All right. I'm just checking in if there's any questions at this point. So the format here is also that every 30 minutes or so, roughly, I check in to see if there's any questions. So while you're listening to this, if there's something that comes up, and remember, anything that you might find puzzling or not quite clear, and you then ask about, actually helps others as well. So please don't hesitate in asking. Okay, there's no questions right now, so I'm going to go on to the next chapter, which is then, well, that's actually titled Spiritual Materialism. First, we see here in the book, and I wanted to include the illustrations, partly because they're so exquisitely executed. It's a gentleman called Glenn Eddy who did these line drawings. Anyway, this is Padmasambhava's, one of Padmasambhava's wrathful aspect, the aspect of Padmasambhava who teaches with the lion's roar that subdues the heretics of hope and fear. And we understand Padmasambhava as the enlightened, the display of enlightenment that accomplishes the purpose and the path of enlightenment. And we also understand this, we understand it, of course, in terms of a Indian guru, but we also understand this in terms of our own potential. So invoking this aspect is also invoking the intelligence and the power, the wisdom and so on, that subdues, in this case, these heretics of hope and fear. We have various aspects of Padmasambhava. Good. Spiritual materialism. Ego is reluctant to really engage in the actual process of the path. When such an approach inevitably creates problems, referring to spiritual materialism, ego acts as spiritual advisor, justifying its own strategies. As such a path is acquisition of practices external to us, they become a collection of junk. So this is then what happens on the path. So this chapter touches on the way in which we mimic spirituality. We end up approaching and collecting spirituality as something external to us. Of course, Trungpa goes on to propose an alternative way, which is the freshness of our own experience. The student may be sincere, yet when the teaching is approached as an asset of ego, as something external, the teaching becomes this acquisition. And we end up becoming comfortable pretending that we're following a path. And this is, of course, where the proposition of a real path is annoying. Nevertheless, this is what we ultimately need to do. We need to identify this confused approach and practice the genuine approach. So when we do find there's some sort of conflict or problem with our approach, then we very often have, and Trungpa has a brilliant example as this, we might have ego acting as our spiritual advisor. We say, well, how am I doing? Well, we think probably what we're doing is the right thing because of blah, blah, blah. And Trungpa says gives this example of the conflict between state and church. And there, then the state or the government might request the ruler, who also happens to be the head of the church, to make sure that the church sanctifies then the dispositions of the government. And of course, this is the problem when our rationality is in the service of ego, our habitual outlook. So we might have elaborate philosophies and religious or mystical writings or instructions to justify ourselves. That's where the path and the teaching are supposed to give us what we habitually want. So they're essentially the rationality here, and all our philosophies are used to justify ego. And they remain then as external objects. They are possessions that we possess, that we collect, and we can go from various traditions from all over the world. And at the end of the day, as we just collect all these various traditions, we end up having a large shop. In fact, a junk collection. And this is where we're missing the point, sadly, of our innate simplicity. We're separate from the teachings. And we're searching for more newer, perhaps more up-to-date, and so on, pieces of wisdom. So unless we step out of this kind of spiritual materialism, we'll never be satisfied. And we'll miss the great point that is, of course, what all the traditions speak about, and that we actually probably are looking for. But in this cycle of acquisition, we remain ever impoverished and ever searching. We might mimic spirituality, but we're just acquiring what becomes a collection of junk. Real appreciation is real involvement, not watching from the outside. We miss the point if we regard the teaching as ancient wisdom. The masters of the past each acquired a living experience. So when we are truly involved, we don't really view the teaching as something external to us. It's more like if we're engrossed, like in a movie. If we begin to speak about or think of the teaching as now we're practicing ancient wisdom, and think of it as something external to us, then we're missing the point that all along history and the lineage, what has been experienced is common to everyone in the lineage and is experienced freshly, uniquely, personally. So you become a practitioner, you put it to the test, you experience it, you check if it's valid, and you apply it to yourself so that you don't have any hesitation in completely engaging with the teaching. So that's where the value of the teaching is established. And on the basis of that, then this is us. We don't imitate or become replicas of our teacher. This is personal experience. So in the case of the masters of the Kagyu lineage, and also the Nyingma lineage, the Sakya, the Gelug, all the various Buddhist lineages that we have, everyone acquired a lived experience, a realization. Just, Trungpa gives the example, just as with bakers who continue to bake fresh bread every day. There's a recipe, yes, that's passed on, but every day the bread is fresh. It's cut and eaten fresh. There is no deception in terms of collecting knowledge. We must work with our individual experiences. When we become confused, we cannot turn back to our collection of knowledge and try to find some confirmation or consolation. The teacher and the whole teaching is on my side. You can't do that. The spiritual path does not go that way. It's a lonely individual path. So we can't use the teaching as a way then of sanctifying, justifying ourselves. We can't turn the teaching into something that justifies who we are. I'm right. The teaching says so. We can't use that. Now, like I said, I'm not going to be doing the questions and answers, but I'd like you to read, particularly in here, there's one question on faith. What is the difference between the naive, blind faith and proper, intelligent faith? It's such a brilliant answer, really. Good. Any questions? Okay. I have a consistent meditation practice and find that I'm motivated by the condition of my mind in daily life. If I'm being caught and emotional, I know that doing vipassana meditation will focus my mind and calm me down. Likewise, if I'm feeling depressed or isolated, Tonglen practice will make me feel connected and happy. As VCTR describes it, it seems like this is just complete spiritual materialism. What can I use as my motivation for practice to avoid getting trapped in spiritual materialism? Thank you. This is a very good question, and I appreciate the length and detail of it. Well, I'm tempted to quote Songtse Khyentse Rinpoche, who always says, if we're worried, that's insurance enough. And I would say one of the beauties of studying spiritual materialism is that we know it's there. It's a possibility. So we are onto it. And of course, yes, we apply meditation as an antidote for our various conditions. So we shouldn't hesitate in applying the path as a remedy. If we get bogged down, we should lift ourselves up. So whether it's shamatha, vipassana, or tonglen, we should apply it. But we should also have the aspiration that it's not something that is just serving us in a narrow sense. And being uplifted is not in indulging in ego. So like I said, I would take the short answer is Tongtse Khyentse Rinpoche's advice. If you're worried, that's good insurance. Someone is asking if we can view the webcam as well as the PowerPoint. Okay, normally I switch it off, but okay, I guess we can just leave it on. Okay. Okay. As long as it doesn't get in the way of the, yeah, to make sure you see the text. Okay. So, surrendering. We may wish to surrender the insecure games of ego, spiritual materialism, yet how much dare we open? Genuine aspiration may lead to finding a guru. How to relate to such a person? We need to give up our expectations and surrender. So, with surrender, we mean, Trungpa says, surrender means opening oneself completely, trying to get beyond fascination and expectation. So once we see then, and this is also in regard to the question that just came up, in seeing then the game of spiritual materialism, we may wish to drop the insecurity of ego, but how far can we actually go? How much can we open? So we will look at such a surrender as also implying opening ourselves to life as a teacher. But if this is aligned with an aspiration to awakening, working towards an unfolding of the mind, as Trungpa just says, then he says we will almost certainly find a personal guru as well. In that case, how to relate to such a person. So that's where the spiritual path becomes a very honest path of not just looking for something that can help us, but really being truthful about ourselves. So our expectations about that meeting and relationship presents obstacles. We will try to make the guru fulfill our image of what the guru is and what role he will have in our life. If he doesn't fit that mold, we begin to doubt him or her. To establish a real relationship, we need to give up our preoccupations and rather we need to surrender. We will need to surrender ego, however familiar it might be. We need to relate to the straightforward quality of who we are. Surrendering our ego is also surrendering our idea of the guru and the path. So this also means surrendering our raw and clumsy ego. We might not like ourselves as ruled by ego, but we somehow feel this is us. And so we're reluctant to give up these games, and we're reluctant to give up all the self-evaluation and self-criticism that we naturally have as a result of our lack of self-confidence. So we can afford to do that, and we can step out of our fascination with these familiar self-centered narratives. What we're intending to do, as was described in the practice of meditation, is just relate to our plain, basic makeup, what is. Surrendering our expectations regarding the guru and the fears of what might come, we need to embrace the reality of what it might bring in terms of disappointment. Our expectations are not being met. And this disappointment is, as Trungpa says, sharp, precise, obvious, and direct. We'll see our expectations are irrelevant. In that, disappointment takes us out of the spirituality as a fantasy and places us squarely in what is our reality. It transforms the path into something real. So it's important for us to come out of our comfort zone and to actually begin to go through a process of being disappointed, not getting what we want. This, of course, is very much prompted by the interaction with Sangha, with the teacher, and so on. We can sort of retreat into just reading books and just practicing on our own. But there's a point where this is clearly stagnant. So we need to engage in the path in a more courageous way. Otherwise, as Trungpa describes, the naive and simple-minded struggle persists, where we interpret everything that happens to us in life as something that reflects our insight about enlightenment. It confirms our own rightness. Holding back might alternatively be to preserve ourselves as preciously spiritual. So real surrender is then settling on the rocky ground of reality. So of course we might just not be adventurous at all and just already hold ourselves as being very spiritual people. So this is where we don't want to relate to our own confusion. We don't want to be honest about our own dirty laundry and so on. So we might just adopt the behavior of being a serene person, someone who metaphorically treads on lotuses, and we interpret events so they confirm our insight and our perfect practicing of the path. We don't want ever to question it. So we want to get over this altogether. And genuine surrender is not about preparing something that suits us, the perfect path and soft landing and so on. It's to actually begin to appreciate what is, and not to be in any way defensive or self-justifying or in any way constructing anything other than beginning to relate to reality in a very plain and direct way, which is then the settling on the rocky ground of what is. When we surrender, there is an acknowledgement of our confusion and our need to be protected from our confusion. And that's what's implicit then in taking refuge. This is quite important. In here, Trungpa Rinpoche defines then the way that we take refuge. I take refuge in the Buddha. And Trungpa Rinpoche says, as the example of surrender, the example of acknowledging negativity as part of our makeup and opening to it, being honest. I take refuge in the Dharma, the law of existence, life as it is. I'm willing to open my eyes to the circumstances of life as they are. I'm not willing to view them as spiritual or mystical, but I'm willing to see the situations of life as they really are. I remember in my own encounter with my teachers and the culture around my teachers, very often, we would use spiritual language to justify ourselves or explain ourselves, and trying to think that we need to sort of construct some Buddhist way of presenting things. And very often this attempt completely fell on deaf ears. My teachers very often just cut through and just were talking about very plain, ordinary realities that needed to be related to. I take refuge in the Sangha. Sangha means community of people on the spiritual path, companions. That means I'm willing to share my experience of the whole environment of life with my fellow pilgrims, my fellow searchers, those who walk with me. But I'm not willing to lean on them in order to gain support. I'm only willing to walk along with them. This is quite an important point, and particularly with regards to the Sangha, then, it's important that we don't think of the Sangha, people who are going to hold us. We've now become Buddhist, and all the other Buddhists, we're going to have a little happy community where we have bake sales and we meet together and we confirm each other. That's not the path. We're lone travelers on the journey, but we know that there's others doing so well, and we look at how they handle their lonely journey. And very often this is very inspiring. I'd like to quote Trungpa Rinpoche in another place, where Trungpa Rinpoche defined Sangha. I can't remember it exactly but it's roughly along the lines of one person giving up their territory and through doing so, inspiring others. So we also, and this also when you take refuge in a classical sense, we very often define what we don't do when we're taking refuge. So that's where taking refuge in greater powers is a mistake. Trungpa Rinpoche says, surrendering is not a question of being low and stupid, nor of wanting to be elevated and profound. It has nothing to do with levels and evaluation. Instead, we surrender because we would like to communicate with the world as it is. So, the mistaken way of surrender or taking refuge is seeking shelter in what we perceive as powers that are greater than we, and which can protect us. So in the traditional context, that means then taking refuge in mountain gods or powerful entities and so on. In the modern or an atheist context, we could say it implies anything that simply provides a temporary solution without addressing the real issue. So it's a mistaken way of taking refuge, and it is then when we are operating with this sense of basic inferiority and basic powerlessness, and that we're vulnerable and looking then for something that can provide us, something that's greater than us, that can provide us with some safety. What is implicit here is that surrendering means that we want to connect with the world as it is. We're good enough. We are courageous enough. We're not embarrassed by who we are, and we regard the world as fundamentally workable. So we don't need to cover up. So working with a spiritual friend requires then that we rejoice in this basic wealth, what we sometimes refer to as Buddha nature, but without being particularly philosophical, just acknowledge that our basic ground is good enough, basic goodness, as Trungpa Rinpoche calls it in Shambhala training. And this is where we proceed with that confidence rather than despairing over some perceived poverty. See if there's any questions. In sadhana practice, when they speak about the purification of body, speech, and mind, would that be referring to the three lords of materialism that Trungpa Rinpoche is referring to? Possibly, yes. Mind you, when he describes these three lords of materialism, he does it very much in terms of more the mind. And when we are doing sadhana practice, we're actually already operating with an inspiration that comes from having experienced freedom from the insecurity of the ego. So engaging in sadhana practices certainly purifies this perception of our own body, our own speech, and our own mind as what we would call in sadhana practice, we refer to it as simply just ordinary. And we basically identify this possibility that our bodily movement, our speech, and the dimensions of our mind could be infused with wisdom. And so in sadhana practice, we're already operating with, you could say, a graduation level that sort of comes at the end of this book. The very last chapter is about Tantra, and that's then where we're going to be talking more about the possibility of engaging the enlightenment, the result of the path, and make that into the path itself. Yeah. So when we do sadhana practice, yes, it does purify the three lords of materialism implicitly, but then also it connects with a vision of that which is beyond, you could say, a greater vipassana. Now comes an important chapter, the chapter on the Guru. And here we have an example of how we represent then the lineage in a classical context. This is the Kagyu lineage, where we have the primordial Buddha, Vajradhara, the great masters to Vajradhara's right, Tilopa to his left, Naropa, and Naropa was then the teacher of Mapa. To Mapa's right, we then have the yogi, Milarepa, the one with the hand behind his ear. This is because he was referred to as Tupaga, pleasant to hear. Some people will say it's also a way of closing certain nadis. Anyway, this is Mapa's main disciple, and this chapter is about mainly Mapa and Milarepa. To Mapa's left is a monk, and that's Gambopa, also a great master. And in the middle, straight under Mapa, we have the Kamapa. To the left, to the right and left of the Kamapa, we have then the Vajrayogini, the principle of wisdom, and Mahakala, the protector of the Kagyu lineage. So when we engage with the Guru, we say we're studying with the Guru, but it is not really a classroom situation as in what we normally think of as study. It is an apprenticeship. It is a process of immersion into a space or a culture of enlightenment. Meeting, as in connecting or receiving transmission from the Guru, requires devotion. In here, a major obstacle then, an aspect of spiritual materialism then, is expectation. And that's what this chapter is going to speak about, how to give some pointers to how we could approach studying with a teacher. So it's important that when we are studying with a teacher, a guru, we're already operating with something that doesn't exist in the modern or the Western culture, and it's the idea of the perfect individual, the sage, the saint, the no longer confused person. We kind of implicitly have it, but it's not really that much on the map in our culture. We very often have expectations that people should be perfect, but the perfect human is very often seen as basically an impossibility, especially in modern times. You know, we shouldn't strive for perfection. So we in the modern world who are approaching this idea, we're already walking into a territory where it helps a lot, where we have an understanding of what is the premise of Buddhism, enlightenment, the possibility that we could actually do this. And that's where we don't just have this as a theoretical academic project, but it's something that is acquired through touching on something which is not objectifiable by the ordinary intellect. So it necessarily takes place in a living condition, in a living place where we're touched and open to someone that we trust entirely. And that's, of course, a very important point with the entire engagement with the guru, is that it is somebody that we regard as an enlightened person. So this is very much a place where surrender, devotion is crucial. So in order for us to understand this better, Trungpa Rinpoche speaks about these two persons really in the lineage, Marpa and Milarepa. He begins with saying the very notion that we will get something from a guru, happiness, peace of mind, wisdom, whatever it is we seek, is one of the most difficult preconceptions of all. Of course, there's many confused preconceptions that we could bring to the path, but we could think that the guru is somebody who will provide these things. And particularly when this was taught in the 1970s, this was very much trending. There was some expectations around the guru phenomenon. Of course, nowadays it's very different. We have there was some ideas that the guru in the 70s was somebody who possessed incredible powers. Nowadays, very often we have a very different perception. It's more about, we think that the guru is possibly just a con man. Implicitly, guru nowadays is very often a dirty word, and it implies somebody who deceives. So, of course, here we are drawing from a tradition in which, yes, you had possibly con men, but you also did have genuine gurus, and the possibility of enlightened persons is key, of course, to what we're doing here, and that is what we're describing. Trungpa Rinpoche then describes Marpa, whose initial ambition, he was a very ambitious, brilliant person, was dismantled by his teacher, Naropa, and Milarepa, who then in turn was a student of Marpa, who was somebody less ambitious. He also needed a lot of processing. I'd like to say that in these webinars, I don't repeat all these stories. I don't retell them. With these webinars, they're not a digest of the book. They are intended to celebrate the brilliance of this book, but it's very much about, you need to read the book. And the storytelling here is fairly linear and straightforward, but there are some extraordinary stories, so you must read them. Briefly then, Marpa's story was that he left his well-to-do background, upper middle class. He became a lama, which did involve a lot of learning and training. Very tough training. He eventually went to India, despite everyone trying to hold him back. He sought his guru. He had heard of Naropa, and he initially had some smooth sailing with Naropa, but then eventually things developed, and these became very challenging circumstances. He was sent to study with Kukuripa and so forth. And the description of how he had to let go of his expectations, his reservations, and so on, and his ambitions is something that's very helpful for us who are on the path. Ultimately, he was very committed to the practice of the path, and eventually he attained realization within the Vajrayana path, and within Tibetan Buddhism, he is one of the great, the giants of translation. And he had accomplished all of this while also having family, having a farm, and looking after his students. So Milarepa, as many people will know, had a very different background. He was someone who had accumulated vast negative karma, murdering scores of his relatives. And as a consequence, then, he worked very, very hard, and also Mapa made him work very, very hard before he received teachings. So he understood then the necessity and was very persevering, but he also was pushed to his limits. Then again, once he did receive the teachings, he went on to become, you could say, the model renunciant. So the student needs to give something, and the guru only wants the student to give up their ego. So the guru might ask all sorts of things and strange things for basically to provide the condition where the student gives up essentially this place of fear that is the ego. So the guru is someone, and necessarily the guru must be someone without deceit. He knows him or herself, and he knows you. The guru's job is to unmask the futility and non-existence of ego, to show us that which we naturally have, this ground that is uncontaminated. So, as we have then, both in the case of Mapa and Milarepa, the various styles of confusion had to be offered, surrendered. And these are very juicy tales about how this happened. This unmasking then precedes the actual relationship and the actual transmission. So that's the offering. And we can't fool the teacher into believing what we are or what we're not. You can go up to the teacher and say, I'm very enlightened. And the teacher will say, oh, that's wonderful. And the teacher will just give the teachings, but there's no real engagement. There has to be the unmasking. So the guru needs to know our world, and if we're really engaging truly with the teacher, needs to know who we are, and then will, in kindness and compassion, without any kind of frivolous joy or amusement, purposely dismantle our ego. This, of course, is where we are talking about someone that we regard as enlightened. That's why we don't have ordinary amateurs referred to as gurus. It's so important that we refer to a guru only somebody who really is capable, who has the wisdom, who has the compassion. So the guru will only accept a student who does not play games and who is direct and straightforward. There's this anecdote in there, the vignette about the teacher who said to a group of students, yeah, you can study with me, but you'll have to renounce all your previous gurus. And it was only the person who didn't want to do this that the guru said, okay, I'll teach you. The others who were willing to renounce their gurus, he sent away. So it's very important that we are honest, and the guru will test. Close students will test and train the students. And so all this talk about ego is not really to establish it as I am like that, I am ego, I am, I'm faulty in this and that way. But it's more that the futility, the unnecessariness of the ego's games is exposed. So it will be a very real, honest place that the guru is taking us to. So we might find the process painful, but the guru has to dismantle this armor that we're wearing in order to demonstrate then true liberation that is free of delusion. So in describing the process, then Trungpa mentions a few sets of stages. I call it stages 1, stages 2, but there's two different, and they're not entirely, you could say, parallels. There is then approaching the guru is like going to the supermarket, seeing all the wonderful things, dreaming of what might be. This is then followed by a relationship where it's a bit like going to court, where we feel all our shortcomings are being exposed. Finally, then next, the experience is with the Guru is like watching a happy cow in a peaceful meadow. We rejoice in our teacher. And finally, we are at a place of no more learning, where we say it's like passing a rock in the road. We don't even pay attention. So the initial stage is then one of excitement and expectation. Then we have the stage where we are painfully aware of our shortcomings and we feel very naked and exposed. Then there's a stage where all is well and we accept whatever the teacher throws at us. Finally, we're entirely on our own. And this is the level of no more learning. We're no longer concerned about a teacher and we're no longer, we say, students as such. So that's briefly on one way of seeing this process. Then there's also the process where we could say that initially we have courtship. You're drawn to the teacher and want to be close. Then there's a solid relationship that follows, and we trust this relationship. Then there's complete immersion into the mandala of the Guru. The Guru is everything. It's like honeymoon. And then there's a place of seeing the Guru as a great teacher, understanding the greater perspective and seeing the universal quality of the teacher. And this last aspect is illustrated then with a story of Milarepa, where he also went through the level of the teacher as someone external. So we would be drawn to the teacher despite it's out of our comfort zone. It might be a bit scary. We might want to run away, but we are compelled. There's this instinct, this intelligence that we know that we need to do this. The Tibetans describe the Guru as a fire where you don't want to be too close, you might get burnt, or you don't want to be too far away, you won't really benefit from the heat. Then follows a process of solidity. We follow through the training, the apprenticeship, and so on. So we don't hesitate. We don't really refer to the path as something that we're just commenting on or, talking about as an external phenomenon. So eventually then there's no need really to be anything special. We surrender and we rely on the teacher. So this is the honeymoon. We're completely surrendered. The teacher is everything. And then also this wears off. And then there's a place where we see the greatness and appreciate the teacher as such, the universality of the teacher, the compassion. And eventually then this is also where we no longer see the teacher merely as existing in terms of an external person. There's the sense of the teacher being within. And that's where there's reference to Milarepa. By the way, this is the first story in the 100,000 songs of Milarepa. I think it's called The Tale of the Red Rock Valley, something like that. Red Rock Jewel Valley or something like that. Anyway, Milarepa was meditating and one day he went out and wind blew him over and he was very weak. And when he came to, because he was, as some of you might know, he was living off just nettle soup. It's very persevering. And when he came to, he had this strong devotion where then Mapa appeared in front of him and said, just why are you sort of whinging? You have it all. Practice, basically. And Milarepa then took that as an inspiration, but when he came back to his cave, he found all these demons called asparas, a sort of class of demons or ghosts that were all over his cave. And initially he tried all sorts of spiritual methods to get rid of it. And eventually he just relied on his own wisdom. And at that point they dissolved. So this is a place of gradually sort of being more integrated with the wisdom of the teacher. Finally then, there's no sense that the teacher is external, and also as such we could say there's a haunting experience of the teacher being with us all the time. The inner guru becomes inescapable. The inner guru becomes the genuine experience of Tathagata Garbha. This is where there's, you could say, our being is thoroughly penetrated by blessing. We're no longer driven by just the ordinary rational mind, but we're profoundly touched beyond language. And that's what we mean with blessing. And that's where something opens, where we appreciate something that cannot be objectified, cannot be turned into the property of ego. And this is then an all-pervasive experience. Everything reflects this. So this place where the guru becomes inescapable is something that could be haunting. We could feel there's always this presence of the teacher, but then again, it also is the foundation for not resisting that and identifying this is intrinsic to our own intelligence. And there's a place of very creative insight and goodness where our being and the teacher's wisdom then fuses. So this is then really the foundation of the entire Vajrayana journey, of taking the experience of the teacher's blessing as the path. Trungpa Rinpoche then quotes the tantric scriptures, saying that you do not see the face of the guru, but you see the expression of his face all the time, either smiling, grinning, or frowning angrily. It is part of every life situation. And Trungpa Rinpoche finishes this chapter then that noting that entering this path, then clearly it's that the nature of the path is not separate from ourselves. The more we realize that, we realize also that we need to complete and complete the journey, travel all the way. See if there's any questions. What is your view? How possible is it to experience these three stages with the guru, even though contact with the teacher is not an external phenomenon? It is possible, and it has always been possible. I know many people will say, well, I attend these teachings, but we're 500 in the auditorium. And that's not really the point. The external teacher is somebody that's part of our life. And at the level of, now we're talking guru, which is already Vajrayana. Trungpa Rinpoche is a little bit cautious about this and says we could also initially just operate with the teacher as a spiritual friend, as somebody who speaks wise words. I know we could have many different spiritual friends. Sometimes we're clicking with, we hear the Dalai Lama's talk, sometimes we hear Mingyur Rinpoche's talk, sometimes we hear Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche's talk, sometimes we hear Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche's talk, and we're receiving from all sides. And there's very much a sense that we're benefiting. We can sort of a bit like the bee that just takes pollen from various flowers, right? But when we are talking about guru here, yes, then now we are talking more about the involved Vajrayana context. Then also we don't no longer really see the teacher as just an external, but we see it more as a relative manifestation, as our inner guru. And as such, the teacher is with us at all times, and whether or not we're seeing the teacher, way up on the stage, or the teacher, we're spending time with the teacher, makes no difference. Very often, in fact, being around a teacher very often leads to all sorts of, a bit, not exactly that we're burnt, but more that we become jaded, corrupted. Oh yeah, we just take it for granted. And the main thing is really that we think of the guru, and the guru is part of us. So that is something we can do at any given time. There's a famous quote from the Samadhi Raj Sutra where the Buddha says, whoever thinks of me, remembers me, dwells in the samadhi of the Bodhisattva. And there's another place where the Buddha says, whoever thinks of me, I'm right there in front of them. So not externalizing the teacher, then we make it our path to continually be in the presence of the teacher. And yes, we have an external teacher that we can see sometimes, but And the external teacher is really just the contributing circumstance, of course, together with our practice of remembering the teacher. But the external teacher is the contributing circumstance. It's a very important part, and we do need to have a human teacher. We can't just rely on the books, but we should rely, and we should, when we relate to the human teacher, regardless of it's just as if it's down from the last row in the auditorium, we still regard this as a teaching from the teacher. That's the Vajrayana approach. Then someone asks, can you have more than one guru teacher? Oh, yeah. You can have lots of teachers. And like I said, also with the, when we have a spiritual friend, we hear something there that's valuable. We hear the teacher there that says something valuable. But again, sometimes there should be a place where there is somebody that we connect with and who we refer to as the root teacher. This might come, this might not come, but it's something that will help us to effectively create the circumstances of surrender. So again, it doesn't really depend on us being in the same room necessarily, but it is more about us being particularly connected with someone. And also, we can of course also, this can also happen with several teachers. Okay. So that's it for today. So I hope you appreciate there is a fair bit of reading to do. Some of you have read this book before. This is, after all, a classic. But please also notice that when you read, when you read this, the text again, there's always new things that we find in the teaching in the book. That's very helpful. So so we read the next few chapters: initiation, self-deception, and the hard way. Thank you very much. Good night.